Let me start by asking you folks some questions. How many of you have heard at least one concert by the Vallejo Symphony? Okay, very good. Is there anyone who had no idea that Vallejo had a symphony? Okay. You're not alone. Don't feel bad, because there are still people who come up to Bonnie and other members of our board who see the little sign of which where she identifies herself as a member of the board of the Vallejo Symphony and say, "You mean Vallejo has a symphony?" Okay. Were there any of you? I really began to get to know various Benicia organizations in the last couple of years because I was invited to speak at Kiwanis, Rotary, and by the Friendship Club. Were there any of you who heard me at any of those?
You spoke at Seroptimus, too.
At Seroptimus. And you came back for more.
I did.
Thank you. Again, I want to thank you all for coming, because you're here as part of a communal event. And it's a point I want to make, because each of you made a decision to go out of your house tonight and to go do something that you felt you might learn something from, or you've some experience that you wanted. And as a result of that, you are now all part of this community, this audience, right here. That's what going to a concert is like. And going to a concert is not a passive experience. Listeners are active, and orchestras know that listeners are active, because if we do the same music for two different audiences, we feel a different energy. And if you were to come and hear us on a different day, if you were to come and hear us 2 days in succession, you would feel some change. That is so different from the act of just simply slapping a CD in the CD player and sitting back and listening to a recording. You can still be actively involved with the music with that experience, but not with the performers. You're dealing with something that has been frozen in time. I'm stressing the whole business of live performance experience, because it is something we're in danger of losing these days. Because people, number one, get very, very wrapped up in solitary activities with their computers, with various other things. But also there are just so many demands on time. Work schedules are longer. It's harder to make a living. So for someone to make the decision to go out is much more of a big deal these days. So I just want to make that point now. And it's something that I'll come back to as we go on. As Doug and Bonnie told you, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the journey of the Vallejo Symphony, first of all. And this will be a little bit of a freewheeling kind of thing, because I plan in general what I'm going to say to you, but what I probably will talk about is the Vallejo Symphony, a little bit about my background, what makes up the Vallejo Symphony, what makes it unique now, what's the state of music these days, why is music important? And then after we do all that, if you're still interested, I can talk with you a little bit about what a conductor actually does. So those are some of the things that I'd like to cover with you this evening. But first and foremost, let me talk about the symphony, and talking doesn't replace getting some sort of an idea of what the orchestra is. So I want to give you a little bit of a sample. Here we go. That gives you a little bit of an idea of what the orchestra sounds like. That was from last May, our final concert of last season. That was Dvorak's Carnival Overture. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit and talk about what the orchestra was and is. The Vallejo Symphony is the only professional orchestra that's resident in Solano County. It is also California's 7th oldest orchestra. It was formed in 1931. First concert was on February 21st, so it rose out of the Depression, and it remained pretty active from that time to this. It started out as an opportunity for people who were amateur players, and by the way, I came across a definition of amateur recently, which is someone who performs out of love and service. So that's how this started. So it started out as an opportunity for people who lived in the community to perform. And it was pretty much that kind of orchestra with a few professional players when I became music director in 1983. And I'll talk a little bit about the transition from becoming a community orchestra into professional orchestra in a few minutes. But since I have brought you to the point where I became music director, let me just talk a little bit more about my background. As Bonnie mentioned, I'm from Ohio, a little town called Berea, which is about 15 miles south of Cleveland. My parents were both amateur musicians, and actually they met through music. My father was teaching violin, among other things, to pay his way through school. My mother became his student, never learned to play the violin, but became his accompanist on piano for the rest of her life. And my wife and I continued that tradition. She was my conducting student. So I was surrounded by music from the time that I grew up, and I started going to concerts when I was 4, began studying piano and timpani when I was 5, and made a little bit of a detour in my undergraduate years to take a degree in history and political science. And then after that, got my musical training at the Cleveland Institute of Music, where I studied a little bit with James Levine, who's currently music director of the Metropolitan Opera, when he was still assistant conductor in Cleveland. I went to Temple University, attended rehearsals of the Philadelphia Orchestra, studied with their associate conductor, studied with the choral director at Temple University, sang with Ormandy, had the opportunity to watch conductors like Carla Maria Giulini, Riccardo Muti, and various others in rehearsal with the Philadelphia Orchestra. From there, I went to Aspen, the Aspen Music Festival, where I spent 2 summers studying with Herbert Blomstedt, who was Michael Tilson Thomas's predecessor as director of the San Francisco Symphony. Through Aspen, I was able to get into Julliard, where I had an opportunity to study briefly with Pierre Boulez, who at that time was music director of the New York Philharmonic. From there, I went to Tanglewood, the summer home of the Boston Symphony, where I studied a little bit with Leonard Bernstein, a wonderful German conductor named Eugen Jochum, and I met Siji Ozawa, who was also music director of the San Francisco Symphony. And so he brought me here to the Bay Area. I was Seji's assistant for 2 years, and then after that, Edo de Waart took over as music director, and Edo promoted me to associate. And so I was with Edo for 4 years. So I was with the San Francisco Symphony from 1972 to 75. The work that I did with the San Francisco Symphony had a very strong influence on the kind of things that I would be doing later in Vallejo, because basically the assistant conductor does 2 things. He waits for the conductor who's supposed to be doing the concert to get sick, learns his music. If he's lucky, he's given a subscription concert, and I was lucky. I got quite a few subscription concerts, which gave me the opportunities of working with extraordinary soloists like Isaac Stern and Garrick Olson. But the assistant conductor also does all the educational concerts. Now, at the time that I was with the San Francisco Symphony was a very, very fortunate time, because there was only one performing venue in San Francisco, and that was the War Memorial Opera House. That meant it had to be shared by the opera, the ballet, and the symphony. the opera took ownership of the opera house during the fall, from September through the end of November. About half of the members of the San Francisco Symphony became the orchestra of the San Francisco Opera during that time. That meant that the other half needed work. So there was a wonderful lady named Agnes Albert, who was one of the big patrons of the San Francisco Symphony and really believed very deeply in education. She arranged to start a program that was done jointly with the National Endowment for the Arts to have half of the orchestra go into the schools in San Francisco. So we split the orchestra up into 5-string quartets, 2 woodwind quintets, a brass quintet, a percussion demonstration, and also a double bass demonstration. The kids got to see these small groups playing for them in their classroom. That would be during the first day. And then a couple of days later, we'd put the entire orchestra together, and then the kids would hear the whole orchestra play in a half-an-hour concert. They got to see the people who were playing in the small groups that they had just seen be part of a larger orchestra. And then at the end of the week, in whatever part of San Francisco we were visiting that week, we would do a free concert for them and their families on Friday evening. So I got challenged with a lot of music. I also got to face a lot of kids. And I also got to see the effect of the music on the kids, which was just really extraordinary. And then when the symphony finally took over the Opera House in December, in addition to the subscription concerts, I was asked to do youth concerts by the full orchestra, both halves together this time, in the Opera House, and they would bus kids in. And the Opera House seats 3,200 people. So there were 3,200 kids and their teachers. And we were able to involve the schools in other ways too. We would do something like Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition, and we would have art students create pictures of each movement that the music was trying to describe, so the kids could get some sort of an idea. And then, during the summer, there was a third component. There was something that we called the Summer Music Workshop, which was done in Lowell High School. The symphony went into residence, and they combined forces with the school music teachers. We would start the day off with a performance by the orchestra for all the kids. And then after that, we would split up. Many of the kids got private lessons with members of the San Francisco Symphony for the first time in their lives, and got to work in small ensembles, chamber groups. They got to meet working composers. So it became very clear to me that reaching out to young people was a very, very important component. So when I took over when I became music director of the Vallejo Symphony, actually before I did that, I should just tell you, I finished with the San Francisco Symphony in the 80-81 season, which was the first symphony the Davies Symphony Hall was open. I then became conductor for the San Francisco Conservatory of Music for 4 years and did quite a lot of guest conducting. While I was at the conservatory, the opportunity for the Vallejo Symphony came. Because I had that connection with the conservatory, I was from time to time able to bring talented young musicians from the conservatory in to fill slots from time to time with the Vallejo Symphony. So that connection was established. To get back to the educational component for a second, I asked the board to see if we could set up a program which couldn't be nearly as ambitious as the one with the San Francisco Symphony, but a situation where we could send small groups into the schools. And that actually started to happen. We had gotten it to the point that every child in one of the elementary schools at some point would get, during their time in elementary school, would get a visit from one of our groups. At one point we had a brass quintet. Another time we had a woodwind quintet. Currently, right now, we have a trio made up of a flute, a violin, and a cello. And by the way, they're coming to Benicia on the 31st to perform at Mary Farmer Elementary and at one other school. Joe Henderson. Yeah, they're performing at Joe Henderson Elementary. These folks are extraordinary in what they do. And I'll talk a little bit later about what they do. I also wanted to do youth concerts for the kids so that they would have an opportunity of coming and hearing the whole orchestra. And so we started busing in kids who were mostly higher elementary and lower middle school age, so that they'd have the opportunity to hear the orchestra perform, and very often featuring people their age as soloists. And then there were times when I would take the most talented high school band players, since we didn't really have many string players in Vallejo, and sit them side by side with our band people and do a wind and brass and percussion piece. So the kids could see kids their age playing side by side. So that was a very important component. The youth concerts have discontinued, partly because the school district was bankrupt, and of course the city is bankrupt. In addition to that fact, time pressures on school. Are there any school teachers here? Okay. Okay. Well, you probably know that there's so much pressure to get so much done in the course of a school day that teachers are very reluctant, even for something as worthwhile as coming to hear the symphony, to disrupt the school day. Bonnie, by the way, had another life as a school teacher and also as a vice principal and so forth. So she knows that scene very, very well. But thank God the mini concerts are still continuing. I mentioned that when I took the orchestra over, it was an orchestra of amateurs. I still remember Bill Thomas, who was concertmaster. The concertmaster is the person who sits at the front of the first violins. And Bill was very distinctive. He looked like Colonel Sanders, very white hair and beard. But Bill, as a high school student, had played in the early Vallejo Symphony when it was first formed. So we had a direct connection there. And he would talk a little bit about that experience. I remember also with great affection Doug Fahler, who was my principal clarinet, who was teaching music in the schools at that time. Those are the kinds of people we had working. I started bringing in, as people retired, young professionals. And that little by little began to change the nature of the orchestra, until over a period of about 6 or 7 years, even the people who stayed on had become really professional. And so we finally had actually a professional orchestra. I'll talk a little bit also about what these people go through. Have any of you ever heard me say, you have, because you heard my talk earlier, have you heard the phrase Freeway philharmonic? Yes. Okay, some of you have. All right. There are about 16 orchestras in the Bay Area, in addition to the 3 full-time ones, which are the San Francisco Symphony, the San Francisco Opera Orchestra, and the San Francisco Ballet Orchestra. Those 3 orchestras really keep everybody incredibly busy, and probably the last chair violin of the San Francisco Symphony makes something like $100,000 a year. Most of the other orchestras have seasons where they do maybe anywhere from 4 to 8, maybe 12 concerts a year. So it's really only a part-time job. And as a result, the people who play in those orchestras also play in other orchestras to make up that income. That's the Freeway Philharmonic. Now, the phrase comes from the fact that PBS actually did a documentary called the Freeway Philharmonic, in which they followed 7 people as they went from orchestra to orchestra, just to see what their lives were like and how they survived. 3 of those people were some of our principal players. Meredith Brown, our principal horn, who at least until recently lived in Vallejo. Carla Ekholm, our principal bassoon. And they also faced what did Carla have to deal with when she injured her arm and had no medical insurance. And Bruce Crisp, our principal trombone, all got featured in that. Meredith plays in 8 orchestras. Bruce Crisp plays in 6. Carla Ekholm plays in about 4 or 5. They're making a living, and they're doing it that particular way because they want to. I'm going to introduce you, if I can, to some of them. I mentioned that I started to bring in some professional players near the very beginning of the time that I was working with the Vallejo Symphony. One of the first was Brian Anderson, my principal trumpet. He came in out of the almost fresh out of the conservatory, and he still now plays in 6 orchestras and is still playing absolutely superbly. He's principal trumpet in all of them, by the way. This is the opening of Mueller Symphony No. 5. This is telling me that I don't have a disc in here. Ah, that's why. It starts out with a solo trumpet. I'm sorry. That's a very exposed entrance, and he played it absolutely beautifully. This piece opens, by the way, with a funeral march. So that's the feeling that you have here. Let me introduce you to one of our other players. I mentioned Meredith Brown, our principal horn. The 3rd movement of this orchestra, of this particular symphony, is a scherzo in which she has a solo right at the beginning. Right here it gets very sarcastic, before it's been somewhat joyful. Now, what kind of harmony are we in? It's a little strange. Where are we going? Okay, we start working our way back. Back to the main key, we're joyful again. I got off into a little bit of analysis there. I don't know if any of you might have seen Michael Tilson Thomas's most recent program, Keeping Score, in which he talked about Mueller and how quirky Mueller could be. Brian's solo at the beginning is da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. Beethoven Fifth is ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum. Mahler totally changed it, but used that same rhythm as a memory and as a tribute to Beethoven Fifth. The whole point of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony is starting with some kind of struggle, and working through it, and then finally coming to an incredible triumph at the end, where he brought trombones into the orchestra in a symphony for the first time, and a piccolo at the end, which is a little flute. Mahler goes through a similar journey, but in a different way with this symphony. But he's remembering that. And you're jumping from around 1809 to about 1899, and thinking with a much larger orchestra, a much bigger group of instruments to work with, and all of a sudden a bigger harmonic language to work with. I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I wanted you to hear Brian and Meredith. And Bruce is also buried in there, and so is Carla. So are people like Kathleen Kamali-Dillon, our concertmaster, Linda Gadassi DeLuca, our principal viola, Beth Vandervenet, our principal cello, who's going to be one of the 3 musicians performing at the school on the 31st. Without them, we would never, on my 25th year, as music director, have been able to do a Mahler symphony. That's how much that orchestra had grown. And that is almost a recording level performance in a lot of respects. And the musicians were so proud that evening. And the audience, I think, was also very, very proud of what we did. I hope and I believe that the music communicated to the audience as well. One other important component that I just want to talk about a little bit is that I know many people sometimes feel, well, why should I come to a concert? I don't know enough. Can I understand that music? And I really feel that there's so much drama and so much beauty and emotional health in this music that if one just opens themselves to the experience, that it can speak to anyone. And just the sheer sound of the orchestra, I would hope, could be very exciting, and is so different. I know you can get a lot surrounded by your speakers, but hearing the sound of the orchestra live in the hall, there's absolutely no substitute for it. But as a way of giving people in, a couple of things which I've begun doing is there's a pre-concert discussion an hour before the concert for about 30 minutes in which I not only talk about the music and play some excerpts, but we interview the guest soloists. And if we have a guest composer, we interview them so the audience can see, music is written by living people. In fact, it was a shock to me to discover that I think I've outlived Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Mahler, and a number of people. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it really brought home to me the mortality of these people and the humanity of these people as I began thinking about that. Also, before we play each piece, I will talk just for 2 or 3 minutes a little bit about what was the composer doing at the time that he wrote this piece? Why did he write that piece? And what are some of the signposts, the that you can get to listen to it. We also try to create some other community experiences. Bonnie talked a little while ago about singing in the Solano Choral Society. We like to form partnerships with other musical organizations. And, come on, say hello. Okay, there it is. And so every year we do, every other year, we do a performance with the Solano Choral Society and also the Vallejo Choral Society. This is a performance of a piece called Carmina Burana by the great composer Karl Orff. And it can, I hope it can be, hair-raising at the beginning. Here's the beginning. Oh, fortune. These texts were written by a group of young people about to become monks, giving up all the wine, women, and song. And now they're railing a little bit against fate. That's what all of this is about. Orff is using very simple harmonies and very simple rhythms, and repeating the same motive over again. So far, it's been very much contained. He's about to let the stops out. Right here. That particular piece has found its way into some very interesting settings because a lot of people find it very striking. It was used as music to play along while the knights are riding in the moving Excalibur. And it's been used in various commercials, including one that I was sent, which was an Australian beer commercial. And the words that they were singing, "It's a big ad, very big ad," as they were running across the field. But that doesn't take away at all, I think, from the caliber of the music. That's why it's used. It's just fun music to listen to. I've spent... I'm going to give you maybe one more thing. Sometimes very interesting and beautiful things happen in our performances that we don't quite expect. We had a visit by a clarinetist named Jose Franch Ballester, who came to perform Copland's Clarinet Concerto with us. And then he did an encore at the end. And I just have to figure out which band it is. And it was a bit of a surprise. Whoops. Come on, say hello. There we go. Okay, this should be it. Our 5 principal strings and Jose playing Oblivion. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off in the middle. But you can see some wonderful things can happen that we don't even really plan. We had literally run out of rehearsal time. And Jose proposed this to me. And I talked with our principal strings about this. So Kathleen, Christine, Linda, and Beth, and Andy just sat down with him. And they just read through it. And I want to perform a lot more of Astor Piazzolla's music because it's heartbreakingly beautiful. It just really touches you very, very deeply. Well, I hope I've made the case to you that we have an extraordinary orchestra in Vallejo and that it's very, very worthwhile to come and visit. Let me go from there just to talk a little bit about what's happening for all orchestras these days. With the economy being what it is, with the demands on people's time being what they are, all arts organizations, even movies to some degree, are suffering because, as I said at the beginning of my talk, for someone to make the actual decision to go out and attend something is a tremendous challenge. There are about 10 world-class orchestras in the United States. The San Francisco Symphony, by the way, is one of them. Another one is the Philadelphia Orchestra. The Philadelphia Orchestra just declared bankruptcy. They're still going. It's just that attendance has dropped off and support has dropped off. All of our orchestras belong to an organization called the League of American Orchestras. And Jesse Rosen, the president of the League, wrote a letter at the end of which he said, it has become clear that if we prepare it and perform it beautifully, they will come, is no longer an assumption. The challenge for all of our organizations is to find new ways of engaging in the community, of being more visible, finding partnerships with other organizations. This is what the Vallejo Symphony is facing right now. There are a couple of orchestras that have done that in very unusual ways. which are serving as models for other orchestras. I'm digressing a little bit, and I hope I'm not going too long. Doug, you tell me if I am. There was an economist in Venezuela who saw that there were young, poor children were suffering and didn't have a direction, would wind up in gangs, would wind up in various other places. So he came up with the idea of teaching them music in his garage. That began to expand little by little, and it spread from city to city, and it became something called El Sistema, the system. And orchestras came out of that. And the music was literally saving young people's lives. It was changing the quality of the way that they lived. The most famous orchestra of that is called the Simón Bolívar Orchestra, which is as good as any of our top professional orchestras in this country. There was a young man who was a violinist in that orchestra who came out of it and became their music director. His name is Gustavo Dudamel. He's 28 years old. He just became the new music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Started his new season last year. And he's bringing that lesson to Los Angeles, saying we have got to go into the schools, we have got to reach young people and show them that music is a way out. Another thing that's being done is something I referred to earlier, Michael Tilson Thomas's Keeping Score series. Now, the part that you know about, if you're familiar with it, is that Michael has taken, with the San Francisco Symphony, certain works and certain composers, like the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, Beethoven Eroica Symphony, the Symphony No. 3, the work of Gustav Mahler most recently, and various others, and saying, let me talk about these composers. Let's make a video. Let's go to where these composers lived. Let me show you the music that they were hearing that influenced them to write these things. The most recent program was about Mahler. He went back to the town which is now in Czechoslovakia, where Mahler was born and grew up, and showed that he was hearing Jewish tavern music being played in his father's tavern underneath his bedroom. He was hearing military bands playing out on the town square. He was hearing Moravian dance music being played next door. All of this found its way into his symphonies, and which to other people seems weird, but that's his life experience. And by going back, and then the other thing that he did was to take us into the forest outside of the town, where you hear the sounds of the birds, and more than anything else, you just hear the quiet. And that his first symphony begins with one note, the note A, boom, spread out over 6 octaves. It's stillness in music. And then out of that, all of these other influences emerge. So this is something that he's been doing with these kinds of videos to try to bring this music to all of us so that we understand where it came from. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The next step was to try to bring this to the teachers in the schools. I remember when my daughter Leah was in 2nd grade, and she told me that every time that she walked into the classroom at the beginning of the morning, her teacher had a record on. It was just a way of hearing music. And there are ways in which music can be used to teach courses. Michael said, why don't we bring the teachers to us and let's show them how the music can be used. And so they actually give these teachers immersion at Davies Symphony Hall for 2 weeks in the summer. and give them some training and then follow-up material so that they can bring these things back to the schools. I'm hoping at some point we can make some of our teachers have an opportunity to have this program available. But then in addition to that, the San Francisco Symphony is doing what we're doing with our small groups, but in a much bigger scale. So that kids are hearing not only symphonic music, but they're hearing jazz music, they're hearing various different kinds of music, and knowing that all music has a value, and that it's just a way of enlivening the soul. So that's my goal. I'm hoping, okay, well, where does that leave us actually with what we're doing? We're having to come back because of the fact that many of you may have heard we ran out of money at the middle of this season. We are coming back. We're not in debt, thank God. So we're able to start fresh, and we're able to look at what do we need to do differently. Can we start partnering with some organizations in the communities that we're serving, both in Vallejo and in Benicia? Can we send some small groups to do recitals, appear at private parties? The challenge is to make our Freeway philharmonic folks available, to find the time. And so that's what we're working on. We are coming back with, first of all, our free annual Pops concert on July 4th. We perform out on the Vallejo Green, behind City Hall, behind the library. Be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 4th. You'll hear a combination of patriotic music. And by the way, for those of you that support the veterans, they're honoring the submarine that was named after General Vallejo. And the crew from that submarine are going to be walking along with a float. So we're going to have a little bit of a Navy theme as part of our music. We are coming back with our first concert on October 8th, and we're hoping it's going to be in the Empress Theater. It looks like it's very likely going to be. I can tell you right now that that program is going to be Beethoven's Prometheus Overture. We have a wonderful young Greek guitarist named Paul Saras, who's going to come and do the Rodrigo Concerto de Aranjuez. But we're hoping that we can send Paul out into the community to play some of the Greek instruments that he plays and play some Greek music for you. And then we're going to finish with Beethoven Symphony No. 8. Our second program will be in March. We'll be doing an overture by Rossini, the Semiramide Overture. We'll be doing a beautiful piece by Gabriel Fauré called Pavan, and then Brahms' Fourth Symphony. And that's as much as we know right now. We're just starting. You know, I've talked a long time. You've been very patient.
Is that the Pavan for a Dead Princess?
No, that's Ravel. That's Ravel. That's also very beautiful.
Yeah.
But you know what? It costs a little more because we have to hire a harp for that one. So that's the reason we're not doing that particular one. We'll save that for another time. I can do one of two things. I can open it for questions, or I can also talk with you specifically a little bit about what a conductor does, if you'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Yes.
Okay. I have to put this down for a second.
Cards from anybody about some questions in the meantime? Anybody have any questions?
I'm going to try to come a little closer. This is where it starts. This is a photostat of a manuscript of Mozart's Symphony No. 35 in D major. That it starts with the composer writing the music. And I'll leave this out here for you folks to look at. Now, I have two scores of this symphony. This is the one that was used for many years. It's full of mistakes. The reason it's full of mistakes is because the guy who had that manuscript hoarded it and didn't let the publishers look at it. So they were copying from a set of parts. So that's what this particular score came from. Johann Andre, the man who had that score, died. It became available, so they were able to make this one. And I learned that as a student when one of my teachers, Franco Ferraro, was pointing out to me, you know, the bassoons and the cellos and basses have the same thing, but they're playing in different places? Wow, where did that come from? That's because they didn't have the manuscript. They were supposed to be playing in different places. So, job number one, get the right score. Okay? And sometimes that's that's a fairly simple example. There'll be times when a composer has two different versions. Someone like Stravinsky wrote Firebird in 1911, and then he wrote a suite in 1919, and then he did it again with a different orchestration when he was in his 60s. So it's a different take on that piece. So which version do you do? They're both good. Which one do you want to do this time? So pick the right score. The next thing for me is to absorb the music, but also in the process of absorbing it, sometimes it's not just enough to study that one particular piece. It may mean I may need to look at a number of other pieces that were written around that same time to get an idea of what that composer's language is. How does he show when he wants soft and loud? Those are called dynamics, soft and loud. What are his fingerprints about writing the way that he wants certain things? So I have to get to know his written language. Then I have to learn the notes. Now, the way that a score is written, at the top of the page, each one of those lines is a different group of instruments. The flute and piccolo are the top two lines. Then come the oboes, clarinets, bassoons, they're down here, 4 French horns, trumpets, 3 trombones, timpani, bass drum and cymbals, first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, and bass. I have to be able to read this the way you read a newspaper. So that's a particular skill that I have to develop. There are some conductors who do that at the piano. Although I'm a pianist, I don't really feel comfortable doing that. And I remember one of my teachers, Herbert Blomstedt, saying to me, he said, I sit at a desk and I hear it in my head. And that's the way I do it. I have to sit down, figure out what was the composer trying to say. I have to walk into the first rehearsal knowing exactly how I feel the composer wants the piece to sound, and then to communicate it to the players. Now, I hold that baton in my hand. That baton by itself makes no sound whatsoever. The sound is made by all of those musicians. And the process is an interactive one. It's not purely direction. I am keeping things together in terms of showing them the shape, the speed, maybe a little bit of how I would like a certain thing phrased. But then from there, they do it. And it's going to feel a little different every time that we do it. So there's a constant feeling of give and take. It also has to do with how much time do you have to practice. The San Francisco Symphony, for example, has 4 rehearsals. And most orchestras have 4 rehearsals. Right now, the Vallejo Symphony has 2. The Dvorak Carnival Overture that you heard when I first put it on was done in 2 rehearsals. And that's because what happens is that our principal strings and I meet and we discuss certain things. How fast is it going to be? How are the phrases going to go? How do you use your bow for various things? And then the team all works these things out. The parts get marked. The players are told in a letter from me how fast certain things are going to be, suggestions about how to practice it, and so that when we come together, we all have the same idea. From there, I have to try to show it to them as quickly as I can. You're going to see, if you decide you'd like to, in June, there's going to be an interview with a documentary about James Levine, who's celebrating his 20th season as music director of the Metropolitan Opera. I heard an interview with him with Terry Gross on Fresh Air just recently. And he said, you know, I don't like to be really demonstrative when I conduct. I like, that distracts me when I watch a concert. I like to have the players know it so well that I can just kind of coast and let them do it. I can't do that in 2 rehearsals. At the same time, I don't try to be overly demonstrative. I try to make sure that my eye contact and my gestures have meaning. There are certain signs that we all use. This is 2 beats. 1, 2, 1, 2. 3 beats. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a softer 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Not yet. Now, a little louder, softer. And your turn. You know, various things like that. So that's just a very, very quick thumbnail sketch about how some of the things are that are involved. And one of the most miraculous and strangest things is that an orchestra can be playing with one conductor on the podium. That conductor can step off. The next conductor can, without interrupting the music, can step on and start conducting, and the sound will change in some indefinable way. Every conductor and every orchestra has a sound in them. Okay. That enough? Probably too much, but thank you so much for your patience. I hope it was enjoyable.